Virgo, God gave you the hardest test of all, and you passed it perfectly. There's something no one told you about that day when everything almost fell apart. You remember the exact moment, don't you? The ground that seemed to give way, the voice that almost failed, the urge to simply stop holding everything together, and yet you continued. Not because you were sure of anything. You continued because you didn't know how to do it differently. This, which seems small, which seems like just another difficult day in your life, was actually the most silent test there is. No test arrives announced when you're a Virgo. It doesn't come with a set date, nor with a warning, nor with that feeling that something important is about to happen. It arrives disguised as routine, disguised as just another task, another problem, another person waiting for you to solve it. And that's precisely where the mistake almost everyone makes when talking about you lies. They think your strength comes from your ability to organize, to predict, to keep everything in order before it turns into chaos. But that's not it. The real test was never about solving. It was about continuing to function when there was nothing left to solve. Have you ever stopped to think about how many times you've internally sustained something that didn't even have a name? A burden no one saw. A weariness you didn't even allow yourself to properly feel because you had more urgent things to take care of. There's a mechanism within Virgo that functions like a judge who never sleeps. It measures, compares, points out what's missing, what could be better, the detail that escaped. And the strangest thing is that this judge never speaks aloud. It whispers, quietly, in the middle of the night, when everything should already be resolved, and yet a little voice asks, was it enough? It was exactly this whisper that grew louder during that period, when everything seemed to crumble at once. When the body tires before the mind accepts rest, when taking care of others became the only way you knew to stay standing, no one noticed, but inside you were being tested in a trial that didn't even have written questions. And the worst part, you didn't even know you were being evaluated. You only knew you needed to keep going, to get up, to resolve, to sustain. But sustain what, exactly? That question lingered silently as you continued to make everything seem under control on the outside. Because there's an unwritten rule Virgos learn early. Inside, things can fall apart. But outside, everything has to be perfect. And it was by living this rule day after day that you began to suspect something you didn't yet have the courage to admit. Maybe you weren't trying to be perfect. Maybe you were just trying not to crumble in front of anyone. There's a huge difference between those two things, but almost no one taught you to see it. Everyone around you saw someone competent, someone who could handle things, someone who solved problems without asking for help. No one saw what lay behind the closed door after the last person left and silence finally arrived. It was there, alone, that the internal yardstick appeared most strongly. Not the yardstick that measures what others do. The yardstick that measures only you, comparing who you are to an impossible version of yourself that never truly existed. A version that never makes mistakes, that never gets tired, that never needs comforting. And the most curious thing is that this rule didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built brick by brick. In every moment someone needed you, and you learned too early that being needed always seemed safer than simply being loved without having to prove anything. But was that really the truth? Indeed it was, and a part of you had known this for a long time, even without the courage to admit it aloud. It was while searching for answers to this that I found this digital book. It's called The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign to a Life of Purpose. And it doesn't come as just another promise of a quick fix, which is exactly why it makes sense for someone like you. It addresses the search for clarity as it truly is within Virgo, a daily exercise in discernment, not an impossible pursuit of perfection. It's a mental attitude, a different way of looking at that internal ruler you carry without needing to break it, just understanding when it helps and when it only hurts for no reason. Any Virgo recognizes this feeling of always adjusting something inside, even when everything seems fine on the outside. Perhaps you're feeling this right now, still processing this lingering question, still bothered by the possibility that part of your story didn't need to be so heavy on your own. It's precisely in this state, still uncomfortable, still thinking, that it makes sense to act, because afterwards life will distract you again with 1,000 other urgencies. The link is in the first pinned comment, but be aware, this content may be taken down. Click now and download your copy. And in the meantime, tell me in the comments, when did you realize you were carrying too much on your own without asking anyone for help? This was indeed true, and admitting it was only the beginning of a much more uncomfortable discovery. Because there is an invisible instrument within Virgo, similar to a seismograph, that registers every emotional tremor long before anyone else realizes the ground is shaking. While everyone around you continued their lives normally, you already felt the small cracks forming, days before anything actually happened. It wasn't magical intuition. It was the price of always being alert, always monitoring, always one step ahead of the next crisis that no one else saw coming. And the problem with carrying a seismograph like that is that it never turns off. It even registers the tremors that come from within yourself. That time you smiled in front of everyone and inside felt the whole ground cracking. That meeting where you solved everyone's problem and went home unable to resolve your own silence. No one asked you to do that. But it seemed like the only way to continue being someone who could be trusted. And that's exactly when the silent collapse began to take hold, without screams, without drama, without any visible warning from the outside. Just a weariness that accumulated behind your eyes, a weight no one saw because you had learned too early to carry it with a smile. Have you ever stopped to think about how many times you were the lighthouse that guided others through the storm, while inside your own light was almost extinguished? That's one of the most painful parts of being who you are. You illuminate the path of those who are lost, even when they are more lost than anyone imagines. People come to you exhausted, confused, needing direction, and you almost automatically become the structure that supports the entire coastline. No one asks who illuminates the lighthouse when it itself is dark inside. And perhaps that's why serving became, without you realizing it, a way to survive. While you solved someone's problem, you forgot for a few minutes your own problem that insisted on returning every night, at the exact moment when silence finally arrived and there was no one left to help. It was precisely at this point that the most difficult test of all began to truly reveal itself. Because within Virgo, there's something akin to an obsessive archivist who keeps track of every mistake, every failure, every moment you think you should have done things differently. This archivist never throws anything away. They organize everything into invisible folders, catalogued by date and by guilt, ready to be opened at the first opportunity for self-criticism. And the cruelest part is that they never archive victories with the same care. That day, when you handled everything alone and even took care of those around you, rarely becomes an important file. But the day you misspoke, unintentionally disappointed someone, or simply couldn't handle everything, that stays stored, catalogued, ready to be used against you, months later, years later, silently. There's a scene that has probably repeated itself more than once in your life, albeit with different characters, someone crying on the phone, telling you about a problem, and you, on the other end of the line, already mentally organizing a solution before the person even finishes speaking. You listened with complete attention, found the right angle, said the right thing at the right time, and when you hung up the phone, the silence echoed. Who listens to you when the problem is yours? This question never had an easy answer because a large part of Virgo was trained to be a safe haven for others, not to ask for a safe haven for themselves. And there's a subtle, almost imperceptible difference between helping because you want to and helping because, deep down, an old little voice insists that only then do you deserve to be around. It was living within this doubt, without ever verbalizing it, that the inner archivist gained even more power, because every time you doubted your own worth, it appeared with another file ready, another documented proof that perhaps you really weren't enough without being useful all the time. And what if the hardest test God put in your path had never been about never making mistakes, but about learning to archive your own story with a little more mercy? This flawed file has a simple problem. It was never put together by someone who knew how to look at you fairly. It's like an exam that only shows the shadow and never the entire structure behind it. The digital book, the divine path that guides your zodiac sign towards a life of purpose, acts as this second, more complete exam, changing the angle of the image and revealing what your inner ruler has always hidden, how much you have resisted, endured, and overcome without recognition. For Virgo, true discernment has never been about finding another flaw. It's about seeing the whole picture. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. Perhaps mercy has never been your strong suit, at least not when it comes to yourself. There's a part of Virgo that functions like an obsessive detective, investigating its own case for years, searching for clues as to what went wrong, scrutinizing every detail of its own history in search of the culprit. And the most ironic thing is that this detective always arrives at the same conclusion. You are the culprit. No matter how much evidence there is to the contrary, how much you tried, how much you gave of yourself, how many times you endured situations that no one else could handle, the inner detective always finds a way to reopen the case and condemn you again. There was one day, however, when something changed. It wasn't a dramatic snap, nor a movie epiphany. It was more subtle than that. It was the moment when, in the midst of yet another internal investigation, a different question arose. What if the crime this detective was trying to solve had never really existed? What if the guilt you carried was just the shadow of a learned pattern and not a definitive sentence on who you are? That simple, almost silly question opened a crack that previously seemed impossible to open. A good detective knows that there's a difference between evidence and an assumption repeated so many times that it begins to seem like fact. And by re-examining your own case with this care, you began to realize something strange. Much of the evidence against yourself wasn't even real evidence. They were just difficult moments, decisions made under pressure, human limitations common to anyone, which your mind registered as moral failings, as if getting tired or making mistakes were synonymous with failing as a human being. No other suspect would be judged so harshly based on such flimsy evidence, only you. And perhaps the hardest test was never solving the case perfectly. Perhaps it was accepting to close it, even without a completely satisfactory answer, and moving on, carrying a little less weight. All this time, you've used your attention like a flashlight pointed outwards, illuminating everyone's path, and like a mirror pointed only inwards, magnifying every flaw until it seems bigger than it really was. The digital book, The Divine Path that guides your zodiac sign to a life of purpose, proposes something simple: to invert these two instruments for a moment. Use the flashlight to illuminate your own path and the mirror only to recognize, without distortion, who you really are after everything you've been through. For a mind that investigates everything, this small inversion can be the beginning of a fairer judgment. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. There's a difference that almost no one explains properly to those born under the sign of Virgo, and this difference changes everything. Perfection and integrity are not the same thing, although they may seem identical on the outside. Perfection demands that nothing be flawed, that each piece be exactly in the right place all the time, without exception. Integrity is something else. It's remaining whole inside even when the outer pieces don't fit perfectly. Think of a garden that needs pruning. The person tending the garden doesn't cut the branches because they hate the plant. They cut them because they know that without that pruning, the plant wastes too much energy sustaining what is no longer useful and never truly grows. You've learned to treat yourself as if every imperfection were a rotten branch that needed to be urgently removed, when in reality many of these imperfections were just part of the natural process of growing. No one prunes a tree until it becomes a lifeless sculpture. You prune so that it continues to live, stronger, more capable of blooming in the right season. Anyone who has ever tended a real garden knows that there is a right season for every pruning. Pruning out of season can weaken a plant instead of strengthening it. And you, for a long time, pruned yourself all year round, in any season, without stopping to ask yourself if that was really the right time, or if you were just too anxious to wait for your own time to bloom. There is a specific calmness in those who finally learn to wait for the right season before cutting anything on themselves. It's not laziness, it's not complacency. It's wisdom, the same wisdom of someone who cares for something living and knows that true growth never happens through pressure, it happens through care. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable revelation of all. The hardest test was never about eliminating every imperfection until something flawless remained. It was about learning to distinguish what really needed pruning and what just needed a little more time to bloom in its own way. Learning to distinguish the branch that needs pruning from the branch that just needs time is perhaps the most difficult skill for those who are constantly analyzing everything. The digital book, The Divine Path that guides your zodiac sign to a life of purpose, was written almost like a manual for inner gardening, for those who tend to prune their own story too hastily. It helps to see the difference between self-criticism that builds and self-criticism that only slowly destroys, without fanfare. For a mind that has already proven to sustain practically everything, only this piece is missing: knowing when to stop cutting. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. There's a watchmaker inside every virgin, someone who has spent their entire life disassembling their own mechanism, piece by piece, trying to understand why it sometimes fails, why it sometimes runs slow, why it sometimes seems to simply stop. And perhaps now, after all, this watchmaker is finally learning something that no manual teaches. No living mechanism works with absolute perfection all the time. The most precious watch in the world also needs maintenance, also creaks from time to time, also has a gear or two that grinds before being carefully adjusted. This was never a reason for shame. It was only proof that something there was, in fact, alive. If there is a God who observes every detail of your story, perhaps he never asked for perfection. Perhaps he only wanted to see if you would continue standing, caring, supporting, analyzing, even without any guarantee that everything would work out in the end. And you continued. That, in itself, was proof. Not the flawless version of herself, but the real, imperfect human version that bore her own weight and the weight of so many others at the same time without asking for applause for it. Perhaps the hardest test of all was never about getting every detail right. It was about continuing to be yourself, with all your inner rigor, your silent seismograph, your almost extinguished lighthouse, and still choosing every day to continue illuminating someone's path. That is the strange and almost misunderstood beauty of Virgo, the ability to traverse chaos while carrying order, even when inside nothing seemed ordered. And if you've made it this far, perhaps you already know deep down that you've passed this test. Not because everything became perfect, but because you never stopped being present, neither for others, nor finally for yourself. Perhaps it's time to put the file away, turn off the seismograph for a night, let the lighthouse rest without guilt, knowing that it's still there, ready whenever needed. You no longer need to prove anything to anyone, not to yourself, nor to that silent judge who was once necessary and who today can, little by little, learn to be quiet. The test is no longer to come. It has already happened every day that you persevered, and continue to persevere, even without applause, even without certainty, even without any perfection. And that, in the end, is the most beautiful answer there is.